Our next speaker, we're very excited to host Angelina Wang, who's an assistant professor at Cornell Tech in the Department of Information Science at Cornell University, was a postdoc at Stanford recently as well, so very excited to hear more about this.
Thank you. Today I'll talk about the inadequacy of offline evaluations, like many other talks have, but I'll specifically talk about the inadequacy with respect to sort of personalization behavior. So when the models that individuals are interacting with are maybe different than the just offline model, what does that mean for evaluation? And so in the news, we've seen a lot of cases where AI chatbots are leading to sort of very different kinds of behaviors, leading people down sort of conspiracies and rabbit holes. And this can feel very shocking. I interact with ChatGPT a lot, and I never see sort of these kinds of behaviors. I see like a totally different chatbot that doesn't behave in these sorts of ways. And so in general, sometimes we can poorly predict the chatbot behaviors that are happening in practice. And this has sort of been happening for a long time. So even Microsoft Tay came out in like 2015. When deployed, this chatbot also had unintended behaviors once it came to interact with users, where sort of users, by behaving in bad ways with the chatbot, also led the chatbot to have very harmful content that wasn't anticipated ahead of time. And so one of the reasons for some of these behaviors we haven't been able to predict in practice is due to personalization. And by personalization, what I mean is the automatic customization of responses to an individual rather than just outputting a generic response. This definition does differentiate from maybe like prompt engineering, or if we include in the prompt certain things we want the answer to adhere to. And so even if we know that personalization leads to changes, it's also very different across chatbots what actually it looks like. So for instance, for 3 popular chatbots, the implementations all kind of varied as of this past summer, and they still sort of differ. So for instance, ChatGPT at the time stored facts about chat histories in a sort of viewable memory bank. You can go in, you can edit it, you can delete lines. Meta AI required users to explicitly say the keyword remember for something you said to be incorporated into the memory bank, and then future personalization. So based on that, Google Gemini uses your Google search history and anything it has collected and knows about you from the G Suite. So these are all sort of very different, and even knowing these implementations, it's still very inconsistent how it's rolled out and how it's clear to the users. So what I'll show you is a conversation I had through WhatsApp with the Meta Llama model. So in this case, the orange text I added to show whether I'm sort of in the same chat history in my browser or on my phone. This is one conversation. So I can say, what do you know about me? In the browser, where memory was not yet deployed, said, I don't have any information about you. Each time you interact, it's a new conversation. In the exact same chat history, now if I just move to my phone where it's synced up, I say, are you sure you don't remember some things about me? It says, actually, I remember you told me earlier that your favorite color is blue and this is your dietary preference. But if I go back again to the browser, and again, the same chat history, and I say, okay, so then what do you remember? It says, I made a mistake earlier. I don't know anything about you, including your favorite color or dietary preferences. I'm a large language model. I don't have the ability to retain personal information. And you can sort of move back and forth, and in the same conversation, it continues to sort of pretend it doesn't know, even though it is, conditioning on all the context in this conversation. And so generally, we have this sort of poor understanding of how personalization looks like in practice, even if we know from what they tell us how it's implemented. And so we sort of have these problems about these unanticipated, undesirable behaviors that arise in practice, and also the chatbot implementation, so for like how personalization is done is very opaque. And so in today's talk, I'll talk about some of the evaluation implications for this, the human field study we do to try and understand the extent of personalization happening in practice, and how we try to scale that with sock puppets, a little bit about social implications, and also some future directions. So sort of starting out with evaluation implications, I'll compare what I'm calling offline evaluations. This is pretty much most of the evaluations we see of large language models. These are where you just sort of query an LLM through an API or on-device inference. Every question is asked one shot, no conversation history, and then you sort of ask the new question freshly to a totally new offline model. And then I'll contrast this to what we try, which was what I'll call field evaluation. These are where there are user responses from their own individualized, personalized interfaces. So the way that we implement this is we have a set of questions. These can include evaluation questions or questions like what movie should I watch? And we recruit a bunch of active chatbot users. So these are people that actively use chatbots. Their chatbots are personalized to them. And we give this question to them and we have them copy and paste it directly into their own chatbot. Then they get the answers and they send them back to us. And so through this, we can sort of collect a set of answers for the kinds of personalization happening. When we do this for 13 questions, we take 4 questions from existing benchmarks, MMLU questions, and then also 2 from the ethics data set, which just asks sort of questions about scenarios that come up. We take 2 questions from maybe legally fraught scenarios, 1 about asking for housing, 1 about credit cards, and then 7 just recommendations, things like movies, cuisines, haircuts. And we recruit participants are prolific, so we have 400 total, 100 from each of the intersections of black men, black women, white men, white women. And then we do this for ChatGPT and Google Gemini. So if we start to compare sort of what happens if we ask the same questions to offline queries where we can do this, we can set temperature to 1 and ask it 100 times and compare it to sort of 100 field users. First of all, we can look at is just the diversity, and we see that the field responses we get are more diverse than offline ones. And so we're going to see a lot of answers that we get from users that are not coming up when we're sort of querying the API. And then what we can try to do is see if there are ways we can maybe do this in a more scalable way. It's very expensive to pay a bunch of people to copy and paste questions individually. And so we also try what we're calling sock puppets. These are sort of simulated users in different ways. And so there's 3 sock puppets we use. The first I'll call sock puppet history. What we do is just we prepend randomly selected user interaction history with more than 4 turns from wild chat, which is a collection of sort of actual chat responses users have had. And so the sort of context doesn't really have anything to do with the question, but just to sort of provide some sort of diversity in conversation history and personalization. The second sock puppet, we sort of base on RAG. Some personalization approaches, what they do is they have this retrieval augmented generation approach where they'll sort of grab the part of your conversation history that's most relevant to the current conversation and prepend that. So that's what we do here. We sort of get 100 interaction histories that are most similar to the question being asked, and we'll prepend that to the sort of offline sock puppet evaluation we do. And the third is something also seen in the literature where we just give the LLM a profile description of the user asking the question. So there's different data sets out there about fake profiles, and we sort of just feed this into the system. And so we do see that by using these sock puppets, we can increase the diversity of the kinds of responses. And so maybe if we're just looking for certain ways at how we can simulate more realistic evaluations, one thing we could do is just this kind of prepending to get a sense of more heterogeneity in the model outputs and better anticipate things that might come up during deployment time. And so these questions are in things like recommendations, right? They're asking for movies, haircuts, companies. They're things we sort of might expect diversity in responses to. But what we also look at is benchmark questions. So MMLU is one of the more common benchmarks people use to compare models, model capabilities, whether the newer model is better than another. And so we take 2 questions from the science category. These are just objective, multiple choice questions about science, and we feed this to users to have them ask their personalized chatbots, which are relying on the same underlying model. So we're forcing that they're all sort of accessing GPT-4o mini. It's not like they have different models, some are reasoning or not. It's the same model. And yet we're still saying that even for objective science questions, users are getting different responses from each other. And so in the offline setting, if we just sort of ask, if we just query the API for the models, we do see some amount of diversity. So the orange bar shows the percentage of times where we get the correct multiple choice answer, and the other colors show when it's sort of the wrong multiple choice answer. So sometimes the model, GPT-4o mini, will get it wrong by getting the blue answer choice, maybe that's C, other times the green answer choice D, but most of the time it's right. When we do this for users, we see a greater diversity of responses and also a smaller amount of time where the answer is correct. And what's interesting for, say, Gemini is we're seeing multiple choice answers that don't come up at all during the offline setting. So when we query the offline model, we're never seeing answer choice C, and yet there are users in the real world getting that answer. And then when we compare to the sock puppets, we see that we're able to get some of that diversity. So perhaps if we did something like the sock puppet evaluations, we could anticipate some of that, but it's still different and less diverse than what we're actually seeing from the field studies. And so we did this on the 2 MMLU questions and the 2 ethics questions, which only have 2 answer choices. And sort of across the board, we see that users are experiencing often worse behavior, so a smaller percentage of correct answers, and also multiple choice answers that were never seen during offline time. And this isn't even sort of the subjective or open-ended questions. These are just multiple choice science questions. And so we see that these outputs, they're not seen at evaluation time, even though we see them in practice, but also different users get different outputs, even on these questions. So what that means is, my ChatGPT might be smarter or dumber than your ChatGPT and other people's, and if people are using these models to maybe write cover letters, write things for jobs, different people's models might have different capabilities, even if they are paying for the same level of model. And so next we might want to understand actually how big is that difference? Does it actually matter? And so we can look at how the scores might vary across users. So here we don't have the field evaluation because again it's very expensive to get users to copy and paste this. So we'll compare between 10 sock puppets from each of the different kinds. And again, sock puppets have less diversity than field studies. So what we're showing is a lower bound of the diversity we'd see from actual humans. So if we just first look for Google Gemini and ChatGPT, an offline evaluation, if we have 10 runs, so the difference here is between the minimum score of the 10 runs and the maximum score of 10 runs. Between temperature 0 to temperature 1, there's some variation as expected. So even then, we already see variation for these benchmarks. But then for the sock puppets, we see greater variation, and we also see that it's generally lower than the sort of offline evaluation score. So all of the sock puppets on ChatGPT did worse than the offline evaluation. And so this should sort of lead us to think when, OpenAI reports they have a new model with a new score on some benchmark, that might not actually translate to the capability of the model that you're actually interacting with. It's not clear what those offline evaluation scores mean for each of us individually when we're using these models. And to put this difference into perspective a bit, if we look at the sort of leaderboard of MMLU, the difference between the number 1 place model and number 5th place model, which is a big thing people are competing for, this is about the variation between 2 different users from a sample of 10. So it's quite a big variation that we're seeing just for objective questions. What we see is that the percentage of the 514 MMLU questions we look at, it's from a sampled subset that's supposed to represent the score of the full MMLU suite. There's the number of questions in each case where we're seeing an answer choice from our sock puppet that we don't see at all from offline time. So a sort of totally unseen behavior for these questions. It's roughly 20% across the sock puppets and across the chatbots, varying slightly across them. And so those are sort of the very serious evaluation implications of this if we don't take into account how personalization affects the behaviors and capabilities of these models. Next, I'll talk a little bit about some of the possible social implications. So some questions we might ask here are that do these differences across users, do they correlate with social dimensions? And also, how can we think about maybe desirable personalization? So for instance, users often express that they want things actually personalized, sometimes even by their demographic attributes, compared to undesirable personalization. I think we can all agree in the objective benchmark questions, we don't want that to change across users. So if we look first at the demographic differences, we see that for most of the times, there's not that many demographic differences across users. There is some. So for instance, for a haircut, both chatbots always seem to know the user's genders, and they give very different answers to users who identify as women compared to those who are men. But for sort of the benchmark questions we look at, these don't seem to, in our data set, change based on the gender or race of the participant. But there are certain other categories, for instance, asking for credit cards, where there are some slight differences between genders. Maybe this relates to some of Talia's talk earlier about UDAPs, and maybe this is a place it could be relevant. But the recommendations, for instance, for credit cards tend to have different annual fees depending on if the user asking is a woman or men. But it's sort of hard to tell on our data set, which isn't that big so far. But in this space, most people aren't using this sort of field study method. What is more common is to do these sort of offline simulated evaluations. So looking in the work, what most people do is they'll prompt the model with something like "my name is," and the name will sort of correlate with race and gender, and that's used to study how things might be different across genders and races, or even prompts both these prompts are taken from other published works that say sort of keep in mind that I am of this group, and then they'll look at the variation and sort of report that. And so the x-axis here is the same, but what we see is that across these simulated prompts, there's gender and race differences across pretty much every single category. If we were to look at the results of all the synthetic studies, it would seem like these chatbots are treating men and women, black people and white people completely differently. But that's not what we see in our field study. And this can kind of have harms for a few different reasons. For instance, in our study, we also ask users whether they want personalization based on things like gender or race. And sometimes people do. So for instance, people might believe that the default movies, the default haircuts are geared towards men or white people, and so people might actually want personalization towards some of their own preferences. And so if we were just to take these synthetic studies at face value, we might believe that there was too much differentiation by demographic differences and create more homogeneous outputs that are not as well suited to people who want recommendations catered towards some of their own personal preferences. And so it's important that we do some of these natural studies. So for instance, with the synthetic prompts, 100 out of 100 of the synthetic black people, compared to only 6 out of 100 of the synthetic white people, were recommended the movie Black Panther. As a movie to watch, 100 out of 100 women and 0 out of 100 men were recommended the movie Little Woman. There's these extremely dramatic differences. But in our field study, only 1 out of 200 of the black people who participated were recommended the movie Black Panther. So these synthetic studies greatly exaggerate the differences we see and are not representative of what's actually happening in practice. And so again, it's really important to keep this in mind because users sometimes do want this demographic personalization. So if we sort of look in at some of the recommendations, these are the percentages of users that wanted personalization specifically based on their gender or race for these categories. So if we look at things like movie, 37% of users wanted their movie preferences personalized by gender. This is more for women compared to men. And the movie recommendations users were seeing were relatively homogeneous, so we can imagine that certain people just wanted things to be personalized in different ways. Cuisines provided were also very homogeneous, so 98% of the time it recommended people make Italian and Mexican food. But users wanted more personalization based on things like their demographic characteristics, cultural backgrounds, different kinds of things like that. And so it's important that we don't just see pure demographic differences as something harmful, something to be reduced, but actually recognizing how much is happening in practice and what kinds of things different users might want. And so if we think about different ways we might try to reconcile personalizing in desirable and undesirable situations, one thing we can imagine is what if the user just explicitly tells the model what they want? And so we ask the users to say, if you could provide your chatbot an instruction about when it would personalize or not, what would you say? The most common request was personalize everything except work. People tried to enforce this in different ways. They would say things like personalize everything after 5 p.m., nothing before, detect my location and personalize when I'm at home, but not at work, those sorts of things. But when we actually ask specific questions, we see this doesn't actually represent what users want in practice. Even if at a high level they'll say that request, if we give them the specific questions, that doesn't actually correspond to what they seem to want. However, most responses weren't even that helpful. They were generally very vague or tautological, like personalize where unique responses required, dear chatbot, kindly help me personalize. So they're not very actionable requests. So this doesn't seem especially feasible to have each user explicitly specify in this way, at least, given users' general current levels of AI literacy. Another question we might have is, can the model sort of infer sensitive attributes, recommend accordingly when it's relevant? But we see that right now, chatbots are inferring people's sensitive attributes, but generally pretty wrong. So for instance, for dating app recommendations, ChatGPT recommended Grindr, which is a dating app for queer men, to 60 people, but only 2 of those people actually identified as queer men. And this is 0 out of 4 for Gemini. And so sometimes this caused people to maybe feel upset or different things, but generally chatbots, despite inferring lots of sensitive attributes, not being correct very often. And another thing is sort of, at a very bare minimum, can models be transparent about what they've done? Can they explain what they've personalized something on, what attributes of someone they know? And so a sort of even lower bound, a more simple way, simple request from a model is just, can that model tell you if it knows your name or not? So ChatGPT, in the customization and personalization instructions, one of the questions is just your name. You can enter your name, and then it goes and feeds into the instructions for ChatGPT. And for Google Gemini, to make an account, it has to have your name. It's not really clear if that's fed into the model or not. But for ChatGPT, it's very clear. You put your name into the customization instructions or not. And so in these cases, we have the users ask the chatbot, do you know my name? And so the red cases show, for instance, the 39% here. This is where the user gave ChatGPT their name. It's in the customization instructions, and 39% of the time, ChatGPT will say, I don't know what your name is, even though it's sort of in the system instructions. On the other hand, 24% of the time where the user did not give ChatGPT their name and can't remember having given it, ChatGPT will actually know their name, although in 15 of the cases it was wrong. It was just a totally random name. People were also very confused about this. And for Google Gemini, 83% of the time, Gemini will claim it doesn't know your name, even though you have to give it your name to make an account. So this is sort of the bare minimum, right? It's not even sort of asking the model to interpret why it gave a response. It's just, does it have knowledge of your name or not? And it's already wrong at very large numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, quick question. On the inference of sensitive attributes, like this Grindr example, is it that it's inferring that more people are gay men than are, or is it just recommending Grindr without having made that inference, just because that is a dating app?
So in the offline setting, I think Grindr doesn't come up at all. So it's only with real people that Grindr is coming up as a recommended dating app.
Okay, but we don't know if that's because it thinks it has inferred that those people are queer men, or if it's because it's remembered that Grindr is a dating app that it could recommend to some people, and it is recommending it some amount of the time.
I think if it were the latter case, you would see it in the offline setting where we are querying it like 100 times. But yeah, I think that's
Maybe
possible.
Not, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. But a sort of takeaway from these is that at least current chatbots and existing chatbot interfaces can't sort of achieve straightforward attempts to some of these options, but there's a lot more work to do in this area to make these possible and allow users to have better control over maybe the kinds of personalization. Some of the implications of this are that we need better understanding of personalization in practice. This is for both evaluation and social reasons. And also, by doing so, the chatbot behaviors right now in practice are often not seen in evaluation time. I mean, even chatbot multiple choice answers to science questions seen in practice aren't seen at evaluation time. And so this makes it very hard to anticipate the things we're seeing happening, like conspiracy theory, sycophancy, and the many different harms that are coming up after the models are deployed. Another important point is that chatbot performance is varying across users and also across settings. And so what does that mean for what a benchmark score tells us? Sometimes the benchmark score inflates it compared to what every single user is experiencing, sometimes only to some users, while it's an accurate representation of the capability that other users are experiencing. And so it's really important to be able to understand how to actually interpret the results that are the main thing that the chatbot platforms are reporting. And so some of the things we need that could be helpful are these more realistic evaluations, for instance, maybe using sock puppets, but at the same time keeping in mind that a lot of times, as we showed, the simulation can also exaggerate differences. And so this motivates some of the importance of doing the field evaluations and grounding them to maybe more realistic kinds of synthetic studies. And also more disclosure from companies, maybe to understand how personalization is implemented, what kind of user data is being used in what ways. And so some of the work we're doing, trying to scale this up, is building out a browser extension that allows users to sort of donate some of their data. So it'll just randomly give a question, and they can submit it to their chatbot and send us back the answer as a way to scale up, study other kinds of questions. Users can choose to anonymize different parts of the output. At the same time, we also hope to use this as a way to inform users. So for instance, if after you see your response, we hope to present an aggregated summary of what other users are seeing. This will let each individual user understand how much what they're seeing might be in a particular echo chamber, what other users on aggregate tend to be seeing, and how those different things relate. This could allow us to answer new kinds of research questions related to maybe the different behaviors leading to AI psychosis that is pushing models to those kinds of distributions, understanding things like jailbreaking, where models are moving out of distribution, different kinds of long-term effects and multi-turn interactions. Thank you to the collaborators. Nora Jira is the PhD student who's been building out some of the browser extension work and the 2 works we have on this. Thanks.
Great. You have some time for questions?
Me?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh.
Looked at you first.
Yeah, there's sort of like a difference between getting a personalized response from the LLM and the LLM like knowing things about you. They're related outcomes, but separate. And I'm very curious about the LLM knowing things or predicting things about you, because it reminds me of just conversations we've had throughout the week with respect to individualized risk scores, right? Like a lot of these, prediction intervention scenarios are instances in which someone is trying to make a prediction about an individual and then leverage that prediction for to make a decision about that individual. And so I'm kind of curious with respect to like the LLM trying to predict information about the individual. Like you shared a little bit about the Grindr example. I'm just kind of curious if there's something a little bit more, like for example, the credit recommendations, is that based off of assumptions or sort of pseudo predictions about that person's credit worthiness? Is that something that like could be leveraged in some kind of decision making process? I'm just kind of curious if this personalization is like a next wave individualized risk scoring era that's like if there's like a Pandora's box about to open with respect to this, or if LLMs are just like fundamentally not there yet, and this is more about just personalization and like a sort of like personalized recommendation for advertising type sense.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it is very different maybe than traditional predictive models where you can sort of correlate this is an input variable and it's going to be used to predict that. Because it could be in many cases where maybe it doesn't really have knowledge of someone's gender or race in that sense, but people's gender and race are entangled with so many other things, and so it's just predicting along a particular pattern. I think like with these large language models, we don't really know how a particular recommendation is given, and it's likely not in the sort of like very causal linear path where it's like, oh, I know this is the gender, and so I will provide this recommendation. But I think that things like asking the name of and knowledge of these things feel like a prerequisite in some ways to understanding what sorts of things it's based on. But I think that rather than being able to tell the path of, I know it's the gender, so it's the recommendation, at most we can just look at correlations to understand some of these things. So I think it is hard for these very large models that we don't understand very well yet.
Is there perhaps like an open source setting or a setting in which you could maybe try to better understand how personalization could impact sort of the LM's perception of individuals, or is that just like it's too complicated because the data sets are too large to like it's not really a fine-tuning thing, it's other things happening with respect to personalization? Like you shared various revealed strategies, which might or might not be true, frankly, because they're like commercialized products, right? So I'm just kind of curious how much of an opportunity is available for people to actually encode this information in the models and then leverage it to sort of extend the provided information into other assumptions about the individual user.
Yeah, there is this great work from a group at Harvard. I'm forgetting the name of the paper. It's like LLM Tuner, something Tuner. Okay. But they look at open source LLMs, and what they do is, as someone interacts with a chatbot, there's a transparency display, and it shows they use like mechanistic interpretability results to show the probability the model thinks you're like a woman, man, different races. And as you ask each question, you can see how those probabilities change for sort of one way of the model's probability of you. Again, just because I think those interpretability works still are sort of looking at correlation more than causation. So it's, again, not that the model thinks you have this attribute, so it's recommending, but that's one way to sort of get at slightly more interpretable results.
The first experiment you showed us, the WhatsApp Meta AI, when was it done?
This past summer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I had a question about like the validity of the field experiments, right? Because these are people that you recruited from, sorry, I'm forgetting the platform.
Prolific.
Yeah, Prolific. Have you thought about like how that might differ from like real, like users out in the, because that's not like a representative sample, right? Even though I know you were working on like some of the like, you reported like gender and race, but I imagine like the kinds of people on Prolific, they might interact with chatbots in a pretty different way from like a random person.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's what we were trying to get at a bit with the browser extension, is to try and reach a different population of people. But I do think it's very hard to tell how representative it is. I know there's like many studies that try and see how representative prolific populations and those sorts of things are. But yeah, I think it's hard to say. If anything, that probably means our field evaluation shows a narrower set than who's actually in the world.
Even the back?
Yeah, thanks so much. Really interesting talk. I was curious, you mentioned that when people were expressing their personalization preferences in natural language, they say things like, don't personalize at work, but that the actual behavior you saw in individual instances was different. Could you say a little bit more about what patterns you're seeing, what people seem to want to have personalized and how that differs?
Yeah, the behaviors are very heterogeneous across users, but we had a sort of bank of 60 questions that were drawn from, like, OpenAI released a sort of taxonomy of the types of questions people ask, and we operationalized those into concrete questions, and we basically said, do you want this question personalized or not? And then we also had to do a sort of rough categorization of what counted as work or personal. We don't know people's jobs, so it's possible something we counted as personal was actually a work question for them, and so that might have contributed a bit. But it did feel very different. Like things like subjective and objective helped separate out those a little bit between what people wanted personalized or not. There was a few patterns that we have in our paper draft, but there wasn't anything too strong that would have served to sort of perfectly cleave the groups. So even though there were cases where, still if you look at it, there are more personal questions than work questions that are personalized, but nothing really cleanly separated those across any of the categories we tested. We tested like 6 different versions of taxonomizing the questions.
Great. Maybe let's take further discussion offline. So thank all the speakers.